Excellent. Well, hello, welcome everyone. Let me pull up our agenda here while our attendees trickle in. All right. Wow, do we only have 6 attendees, or are we just waiting for them all to appear?
23, I got them.
Well, but that counts all our panelists.
With us, yeah. Right now we have 6. I think there were last time I checked 10 people who
Signed on. Oh, okay.
registered. So
We've got decreasing public enrollment, so that might be to Curtis's point here.
We're missing, I think, Mary Lepre. Is there anyone else we're missing?
It's hate month, Stacey. It's hate month, that's all, on the island.
I'm sorry,
Hate month.
hate month?
Yeah, they call it hate month in March.
Oh. I was like, whoa, what'd I miss?
Everybody's just grumpy because winter's still there and.
I see. So it's even with vacation 2 weeks ago, people aren't quite happy yet. All right.
Grumpy.
Well, some of us are.
Yeah.
Grumpy?
No, happy.
Okay, so I think, Samanish, do we have everybody? Have you sort of looked at our?
yeah, I think we are
Good, except for Mary.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay, so let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome. So this is the 8th meeting of the short-term rentals working group. Our objectives today are we have a fabulous panel for you, and we're going to introduce them or let them introduce themselves in a couple minutes, but really grateful to have guests from Palm Springs, Scottsdale, and Honolulu who are here to tell us a little bit about their journeys down the road of short-term rental regulation. And so that's going to be one of the pieces of our agenda. And then we also did some work asking you all to share your thoughts about another of the promising policy levers that we have been talking about. This one is a lever of 1 short-term rental per owner limit. So trying to limit the number of permits that and for renting short term that any owner could have to 1. And so we have assembled all of your thinking on that, and we'll have a chance to talk about that as well. And then lastly, we'll take a little bit of time to talk about updates on data gathering and meeting schedule. Any question about our objectives or our agenda? Okay. Meeting summary from February 14th. We sent that out to you all last week, I think, or yeah, last week. Any comments or things that we missed, things people want to name?
I think I sent some to you, Stacey. Did you get them?
Yes, you did. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. So Kathy will make those revisions.
Okay, thank you.
Great. So given that, does somebody want to call for approval of the meeting?
Motion to approve the meeting summary from February 14th with Kathy's corrections or amendments.
Second.
Great. All approve, raise your hands or electronic hands. Anyone opposed, just speak out. All right, great, approved. So before we jump into the business of the meeting, I did want to I wanted to raise an administrative question that has come up. We've gotten a request from a member of the public to move public comment to the beginning of the meeting from the end. So I got a request from the group members to bring this to all of you. So let me put out there just a little bit of my thinking about why I tend to put it at the end. So one thing I heard is, oh, groups that put it at the end do so because they don't really want public comment. And I absolutely do not want people to think that this group does not want public comment. At the same time, what I've often found is that having public comment at the end gives people a chance to actually weigh in on the topics and the discussion that the group has had. So it just seems to be much more on point and focused on actually where we are, rather than just comments that that may be just in general or not as tied to the agenda or the actual points or conversation that the group is having. And people lose out on the chance to to weigh in on what they heard the panel members discussing and what they think might have been missing. So with that, let me open it up. Peter.
I understand what you're saying, although I think as most people that listen to the prior meeting that we had, they have an agenda item that they want to talk about. I almost think that we're asking people to sit through 3 hours of talk and listen to this one meeting and ask them if they want to comment on that one meeting. I think the community participation should be, let them talk about what they want to talk about. And I think having it earlier rather than later is fairer to the community. That's all.
Okay, John.
Well, I tend to agree more with you, Stacy, that given the length of time between our meetings, most likely the public comment would be most valuable if it was on what they heard this time, rather than something 2 or 3 weeks ago. So I would be more in your camp of leaving it where it is.
Okay, and just to name also, the public is welcome to send email that then we get out to all of you. So speaking at the meeting, if they have sort of comments in general, maybe sending by email is also a way that people can do that. David?
Yeah, I want to be clear on what the intention of the public comment is. Is it supposed to be like we have at the planning board or the select board has, where it's public comment for things that aren't otherwise on the agenda? Or
No.
it's just public comment in general?
Yeah, I mean, the way I have often framed it is it's really public's ability, chance to comment on the discussion that we've been having, right?
Yeah.
Because I know the select board has a chance for public comment at the beginning on stuff that isn't on the agenda, and then they have chance for public comment at each item or at certain items, right? When it's relevant.
Yeah, so, well, if it's not on the agenda, they can't address it. So that's the public comment in the beginning of the meeting, that if it's not on the agenda, someone can stand up and speak their mind, but no one on the board can address it because it's not on the agenda.
Right.
Planning board, we do ours at the end of the meeting. And again, it's for stuff that's not on the agenda. But if it's public comment for things on the agenda, I would favor the end because they're commenting on last time's meeting then, right? It just makes more sense for them makes more sense to have a full meeting and then get the comments. So I guess not understanding what the motivation of the person that asks is, because we'd like to accommodate them, right, if we could, but so my preference is at the end, unless someone that person can give us a really good reason.
Thanks, David. Jim?
Yeah, I just want to agree that I think comments at the end are better. I understand some people may not want to sit through the whole meeting. I hope they know that the public comments usually come about 8:30 or 8:40, so they could definitely come back and get to them. And if not, it's probably, if they want to keep it on, it's a wonderful opportunity to fold your laundry while you're, watching this meeting.
Yeah, thanks. John?
Yeah, just, and I think, Stacy, now that, we're going back to 5 till 8, it's not like we're asking them to stay till 9 o'clock, the way we have with the last couple of meetings. So it's easier than it, going forward.
Yeah. So let me propose this, and Peter, you can tell me what you think, which is maybe it would be helpful for us to add to the agenda that any comments, if people want to submit general comments to the group, to feel free to email them to Semanish, and we'll make sure that they are shared with the group. And similarly, it might be helpful for me at the beginning to remind all our attendees, and I can do that right now, we do have this Q&A box in the webinar, and they can type in their question or comment at any time, and all of you, the panelists, can see it. So it's sort of an extra opportunity at any point to do that, but that other than that, we will keep the actual open public comment to the end of meetings. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, I don't have any problem. I never had any problem. I just thought it was an interesting idea. I do think we're dealing with a hot political issue.
Yeah.
And I think people might listen to the meeting or read something in the newspaper that they disagree with or agree with and want to get it out and talk about it. And we're the only ones they've got to talk to. So that was my feeling about it. And, listen, I don't really care which way it goes. I have to sit here so they can sit here. But I just thought it was a interesting idea.
Okay, great. Thanks. Okay, with that, I think I'm going to turn this over to our panel, and Semanish is going to get us started there.
Yeah, thank you, Stacy. So for those of you who don't know, maybe members of the public, we had an awesome idea from our working group members to have a panel of other community members who have gone through the short-term rental regulation process, and have them come and talk to this group about their experiences, and have an opportunity to ask them questions. So we reached out to a number of communities based on recommendations from our working group, and we are so thankful to have 3 representatives here. We have Patrick, Brent, and Lena, and I will spotlight all of them once the discussion starts. How the structure of this conversation is going to go is we have some preset questions that will give them an opportunity to answer, and then we'll leave the last portion of this meeting, or of the section of the meeting, for you guys to ask any questions that you might have. So Patrick, maybe I'll have you go first, and then we can go to Lena, and then to Brent. So the first question is, please introduce yourself and your role with short-term rental regulations in your community. And then if you could talk a little bit about what prompted your community's actions towards regulation, what were some of your policy goals, and what policies has your community implemented? So Patrick, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, good evening. Thank you. My name is Patrick Clifford with the City of Palm Springs. The department I work in is called the Department of Special Program Compliance, and our department oversees the vacation rental program within the city. I started with the City of Palm Springs in 2017, and I've been heavily involved with the enforcement and administration, and within the last year, the policy kind of coordination with respect to vacation rentals. And particularly, vacation rentals have always been a prominent thing in the City of Palm Springs. We do have a very heavy tourism industry, especially in our winter months. And so there's always been short-term rental activity in the City of Palm Springs. What prompted actions for regulations? It could be just the advent of technology as it's made it easier and easier for more constituents and visitors to utilize the platforms, one from a property owner's aspect and one from a visitor aspect, it did increase the number of vacation rentals that we did see in the city. And so prior to 2017, there were ordinances already in place to help kind of regulate the vacation rental industry with respect to permitting process, rules that owners and guests and agencies had to follow. However, when 2017 came around, there was a real push whether should short-term rentals continue as far as being part of the city of Palm Springs is a tourism industry, or really to look to phase them out. One of the big concerns regards to the latest ordinance, or the one in at least 2017, is how to mitigate the impacts in single family residential zones from this transient use that we've seen happen in those single family residence zones. So the ordinance that was created in 2017 really came to a balance, I would say, to help alleviate the concerns that we were seeing from constituents within the city that were concerned about vacation rentals in single family residence, and also allow the opportunity for property owners to utilize their properties to be vacation rental properties, and then come to a balance, like I said, to mitigate any kind of hotel feel that you might feel in those single family residence zones. So in 2018, there was a constituent led driven vote to ban vacation rentals in single family residences outright. That vote did go, and that initiative was turned down 70% to 30%, and in favor of allowing short-term rentals to stay in continue in the short-term or city of Palm Springs. And one of the reasons why we believe that vacation rental industry in Palm Springs is still healthy is because we do have a very strict and very well-regulated ordinance that helps make that balance and let it continue to thrive. And so that leads me into really what was a success, what success story really came out of it. And it was because in 2017, permit fees were increased from, I believe, probably $200 to $400 up to $900 to help fund a specific department to help administer and enforce regulations in the city. So this was a brand new department and team that was created solely funded by permit fees. And so what that allowed us to do was really just focus on vacation rental ordinance and make sure that the goals from the city council, what they adopted, were being envisioned within the city. And so that was the big success story out of this ordinance, is that it worked because we had a department's focus to make it work. And some of the challenges that we've seen now is that although that from a nuisance standpoint from vacation rentals, maybe that were coming in from guests, have been pretty much reduced. The next challenge that we see is how do we mitigate, or how do we control or navigate density in our city, and the question that just came up with our latest ordinance that passed in December was that question is how many or too many vacation rentals in the city of Palm Springs. And so prior to this latest ordinance that was in December, we didn't have policy to limit how many vacation rentals were in the city of Palm Springs. Really, our control was how many vacation rentals a person can own in the city of Palm Springs. So that still did not really reduce how many vacation rentals were in the city, just really reduce how many one person can own. And so with our latest ordinance, understanding the challenge that we still have going forward is how to control how many are in the city. The city council passed and adopted an ordinance that really focused on density and control how many that we can have in the city with respect to organized neighborhoods. And so in our city, we have 51 to 52 organized neighborhoods that have geographical boundaries that that were created within the city. And we use these as kind of like a point to administer a defined percentage of how many vacation rentals can be in that neighborhood. Our city council adopted a measure of 20% to total residential homes in that neighborhood. Now, these residential homes consist of apartments, they consist of single-family homes, they consist of mobile homes and condominiums. And so that total number is what we use to identify how many vacation rental, what we call certificates, we would permit in each respective neighborhood. And so that's the challenge going forward, is taking what we're doing currently, and we made a plan to revisit our ordinance every couple years to see what's worked and what we can improve on. And it'd be interesting to see how this has impacted the total number of vacation rental permits that we have in the city, how much growth can further go in our city, and is this really alleviating what our constituents are feeling when they might feel that there's too many vacation rentals around them. The challenge from this density is, although it has limited how many vacation rentals we could put in a neighborhood, it does not necessarily target a single one particular house and eliminate one resident that might be a permanent resident in the city, but it doesn't stop their neighbor to the left or the right, to the front, to the back of them being all vacation rentals. So there is situations where a permanent resident might be surrounded by a vacation rental property. And so that's the challenge that we're seeing going forward is, will this help alleviate, or do we need to come back in a couple of years and look at different measures of how to enforce our density measures?
Great. Thanks, Patrick. Lena, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk a little bit about your experience in Honolulu.
And I'm just going to jump in very quickly, Lena, just to tell the group, if you have questions as they're going, feel free to write them in the chat. We're going to let each of them answer these questions before we turn to your questions. But if you want to put them in the chat so you don't forget them, feel free.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lena Pomswan. I'm with the Department of Planning and Permitting in the County of Honolulu. Hawaii is made out of 8 different islands, and we have 4 counties on the different islands itself. So I focus on zoning and land use planning for the short-term rentals. I help with the review of the ordinance that was passed and helping with the implementation. So the startup of the program itself for registration, explaining information and making it accessible to the public, and working with our enforcement team to, I guess, interpret what's been passed. So part of the reason why the short-term rental ordinance bill was passed was we have a big affordable housing crisis here. So the average median rent here for a 1-bedroom is $1,700. For a 2-bedroom, it's $2,200. We import a lot of our food as well as our fuel. And so during the pandemic, we started to see a slowdown of tourism, where it really kind of opened up a lot of our open space and our beach parks and whatnot to our community. So we definitely saw a huge shift of just lots of tourists coming in versus you could just find parking. You could be walking at your beach and it'd be fine. So those were kind of a mix of why our short-term rental ordinance was passed. It was also, our mayor's policy goal to help address affordable housing here. So so since the 80s, we already knew that short-term rentals was starting to become an issue here on Oahu. So in the land use ordinance is how we implement our short-term rental policy and program. In the 80s, basically how do I say this? So basically in the 80s, our land use zoning districts started to only allow short-term rentals in resort areas. So anything that was, any dwellings or units that having short-term rentals prior to that, we would give them a non-conforming use certificate so they can still be able to use that use. But in terms of new units or new short-term rentals, they can only be in the resort area. Yeah, and then in 2019, we also started to work on this ordinance. That is when we first started talking about in terms of enforcement, internet advertising to be able to use it as evidence to kind of give us the leeway to do violations. And then we got into our 22 ordinance last year. So it's taken some time, and we definitely have, you know, our challenges. So we can go on to talk about that a little bit later.
Lena, can you just say what your 2022 ordinance did? What?
Oh, yeah.
The content?
Yeah. Yeah. So for the 22 ordinance, it is restricting short-term rentals mainly in the resort area, compared to the other ordinance in 2019, where they were trying to say if there are apartments in a certain feet of the resort area, they could be able to do it as well. So this, it's mainly short-term rentals in resort areas and specific maps that were approved in the ordinance. It started the registration process for short-term rentals. So they have to apply every year, and there's certain documents that they have to give us, and we have to see their advertisements as well. So that will help with the enforcement branch. And then let's see. So it also tried to change the definition of short-term rental. So right now our definition is 30 days or less. What was passed in ordinance was 90 days. Right now we have an injunction preventing us from implementing that. So we're still enforcing 30 days at this time.
Thank you, Lena. Brent, I want to turn it over to you to talk a little bit about your experience in Scottsdale.
I'd love to do that. Can I share a screen too?
Sure. Yeah, let me.
It's disabled right now, but let me know when it's okay.
Sure. You're all set.
Okay. All right. So my name is Brent Stockwell. I am an assistant city manager here at the city of Scottsdale. And I've been actively involved in short-term rental issues since about March of 2021, when our city council asked our city manager to form a short-term rental working group and to report back to the council. So let me just give you a little bit of context on the scope of the short-term rental issue in Scottsdale. So we have about 5,000 properties out of 140,000 units citywide. We have started a licensing process there. They've all been required to have one as of January 8th of this year. And we currently have 61% of them licensed or in the process. So much of the issues that were mentioned in Palm Springs, we definitely have an issue about them not being, or Honolulu for that matter, not equally spread across the community. And 70% of our short-term rentals are just in the lower 16 miles of our community. And that's a density per square mile of about 221. Similar to the other two communities, we are also a tourism destination. We have more than 50 hotel properties in our community with more than 9,000 hotel rooms. But if you take 5,000 STR units and think that, you know, typically each one of them has about 3 rooms that are available within that, that means we have about 15,000 rooms that are short-term rental units on top of the hotel rooms. And that has definitely caused some challenges on occupancy and other things on our tourism side. So another thing that's important to understand about Scottsdale is in Arizona, cities and towns were preempted by the Arizona legislature from prohibiting short-term rentals. And so initially they said we could only limit regulations solely for public health and safety if that could be demonstrated. And then in all other matters, cities have to treat rental similarly to single-family owner-occupied and long. Just last year in the 2022 legislative session, the Arizona legislature allowed cities and towns a limited ability to require licenses for operation, very limited information we could ask for, very limited circumstances where we could deny or suspend one. And so the overall approach of the mayor and council and the leadership of Scottsdale is we want to really make sure that we're doing everything we can to manage impacts from short-term rentals. And I think that's really applicable to you all as well. Let me talk briefly about the process that we used in Scottsdale. So we set up a resident working group. I was the facilitator of that. We had 12 residents, including 2 realtors, 2 hoteliers, and 2 council members. We met 6 times over a 12-week period of time, developed 9 recommendations, and the night after our last meeting, the council unanimously adopted those, and staff has been implementing them ever since. So I have, since July of 2021, have been actively implementing our short-term rental working group's recommendations. The purpose of our working group was to identify opportunities for the city, to improve monitoring and enforcement of regulations, to ensure that the city was doing everything it could to manage the impacts from short-term rentals. Prior to that time, the council was mainly telling residents, hey, the legislature preempted us on this, there's nothing we could really do. That answer was really insufficient. And so we actively worked together, both staff and the short-term rental working group, to come up with these recommendations. Our strategy can be summarized on the screen that's shown there. Basically, we wanted to increase the likelihood that negative impacts can be prevented, that enforcement is timely by the police department or code enforcement when violations occur, that residents know what the process is to handle problems when they occur, and that we wanted to make sure that the ordinances reflected the full authority granted under state law. So here's a summary of the 9 recommendations that we came up with. There's subpoints on each one of these. These are all available on our website as well. First one's about improving enforcement. They did fund a police enforcement unit and additional code enforcement inspectors to specifically focus on short-term rentals, to work with the industry to improve compliance. So I've had numerous meetings with both Airbnb and Expedia VRBO to talk to them, to better understand how their systems work and how they could work with us on compliance, to use technology to identify properties and contacts. So we have actually contracted with a technology provider to do that. We've also created a beacon data service to make it easier for our members of the public to learn information about properties, to ensure revenues are being collected. So we've worked on that. We've strengthened ordinances. So I've actually been involved in 3 ordinance amendments to take advantage of the full authority of state law. We've also spent a lot of time about improving information for residents, neighborhoods, and owners. We have an owner and a visitor guide out there, and we're working on improving a residence guide as well. And of course, we've also been advocating for changes to state law. So we have a number of relevant laws and ordinances. There's 2 big pieces to it. There's our nuisance party and unlawful gatherings ordinance. That applies to all properties, all residential properties in the city, not just short-term rentals. And we've actually gone through a process of refining that to better define what excessive noise is, how it's measured. And then also we use civil penalties through city court for that. And then we also have a vacation rental ordinance, and that talks about the licensing provisions, and also has additional public health and safety requirements, such as required cleaning in between stays, required pest control. We've required pool barriers to be upgraded to the latest standards. We gave a 6-month period of time for that. And then we also have a sex offender background check and a neighbor notification elements in there. All of those things are allowed under state law. So there's my 7 minutes, but I wanted to give you a quick overview of what we've been doing in Scottsdale. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brent. So Patrick, let me come back to you. I think the group would love to hear, what has been working well in Palm Springs? What are some of the biggest strengths and also some of the biggest challenges that you faced with your regulation and the process of regulating short-term rentals?
Yes, thank you. And maybe I jumped ahead, apologize from the intro and went into my successes or what I thought were successes. But really what has worked well is the compliance part and administrative part of our ordinance. So our ordinance of 2017 really detailed out a nice regulation where even though prior to property owners and agencies were applying for vacation rental certificates, it really gave the authority to us to have dedicated staff to do so. And currently we have over 2,700 vacation rentals in the city of Palm Springs. So, and we have staff dedicated just simply processing those applications. And so the real success part is really the administrative and compliance aspect of the regulation to really reduce the nuisances that were created by vacation rentals probably in the past. As I mentioned earlier, the challenges that we're seeing right now is the density that we're into the city. So where some parts of the city might have been a little bit more affordable to buy a vacation rental, what we saw when COVID occurred, where the behaviors of everyone changed and really started doing buying secondary homes to remote work. We did see a lot of homes being purchased in more affordable areas to use as vacation rentals too. So we did see some large concentrations come into certain neighborhoods and really from a density perspective, really offset the balance of how many permanent residents may be in those neighborhoods compared to short-term rentals. And for example, we do have one neighborhood that I do know that's close to maybe a little over 40%, close to 50% are vacation rentals compared to residents. And so while that is half almost, it really puts a concern where if all of those are concentrated on a few streets or a few city blocks, really could impact how neighbors might be feeling that they're being surrounded for vacation rentals. So I think the challenges going forward is really to see how we can approach density and see if we can alleviate that going forward.
Thanks, Patrick. Lena, I'm going to turn it over to you. Same question.
So for us, in terms of strengths, we've found that it's really helped us in terms of working with the community to address this issue. So there are a lot of people that are really supportive of us enforcing short-term rentals and being stricter about it. So being able to give a violation because we have seen the advertisement online, that's been helping us in terms of like reducing illegal short-term rentals. So the flip side of that in terms of enforcement, an issue we've been facing is the walk-up kind of violations. So for example, if we get a call from the community saying this place is doing short-term rentals, we've been seeing people coming in and out, they're disturbing our neighborhood, they're taking over parking. It's really hard for the inspectors to go and write up a violation unless they see something. So if no one's there, if they don't see anybody, they can't really act upon it in terms of a violation. Our fines are a lot stricter as well. So we've been seeing a lot of change in terms of like community and neighborhood impacts. So let's see what else. So for our budget, they approved, the city council approved a new branch for enforcement. So it's about 6 inspectors and a branch chief. They want to expand that eventually to help with the administrative part of registration. So registration that is something that's been a bit of a struggle since it's very new for us. So I just want to give a timeline of how the ordinance happened for us. So in fall of 2021, we started to present to the Planning Commission and have public hearings about the ordinance itself. And then it took until April of the next year for us to get it signed and approved. So, and then after that, in terms of implementation, we had until October to create an entirely new system to start this registration process. So definitely something that I would say for the working group to think about is to give yourself a big timeline or some extra wiggle room to create from planning and ideas to the actual implementation. Because there have been some hiccups and some things you won't get to address in the ordinance itself or whatever you guys are thinking about doing. But for example, we found that registration was actually quite difficult to process because we were having this huge influx and only so much staff to support it. And then so some of the documents that we were requiring was like a title report, insurance, floor plans, showing that the neighborhood association allowed it, allowed short-term rentals as well. So going through all of those things, it does take time for us to do. So, and also something that we want to work on, and I think would be a great idea for you guys as well in terms of enforcement, is doing like an MOU basically with the hosting platforms like Vrbo and Airbnb. So you're able to see on their end, like what are the advertisements and stuff like that.
Thanks so much, Lena. Brent, over to you.
All right, so I think the strength of what we've done is we had a really good process. So we had a really good process with the working group. We really worked through that to make sure that everybody really thoroughly understood what the environment that we were operating in was, that they thoroughly understood all the efforts that we had already tried. And they were really working collaboratively together to come up with solutions. And it was really helpful too, having 2 city council members on there to really think about those issues from the perspective of how they might be perceived from the community and also the industry and also kind of the city's overall regulatory philosophy. So I thought that was really good. The other thing is that we really made sure that from the city's perspective, we had a very strong response team put together. And so I'm involved from the city manager's office, but we have the police department, the fire department, our solid waste provider, code enforcement, business regulations, the city attorney's office, all involved in it, all looking at everything from their perspective. And then the other thing that we've really done is we've really made sure that we are really thinking about this and listening about this, both from the resident perspective, from the perspective of those that are living around short-term rentals, and also from the owner perspective. And one thing we try to be really fair and balanced on is making sure that we're kind of striking the right balance there. It is a real challenge to be in an environment that is heavily regulated by the state. It's important to understand that prior to 2016, short-term rentals weren't allowed in the community. So they were banned in Scottsdale, any rentals of less than 30 days, similarly to what Lena had mentioned. We did have timeshare properties within the community and obviously did have hotel properties in the community. So there were abundance of short-term stay opportunities. There just wasn't any room for that. The other thing we did is with those 9 recommendations that were approved, we also made a commitment to update the community and the working group and the mayor and council quarterly on that. So on our short-term rental website, we do have a quarterly report that includes data that we're looking at on a regular basis and update on our progress that we're making over time, which is something that, you know, really helps build trust and credibility with the community too. So we've worked to try to do quite a lot of transparency with this process, so people are aware of that. And then even as we started the licensing process, I do a weekly email to council on exactly where we are with the application process and approval process. And then also because what we did is when there was still properties that weren't complying as of January 8th, then we issued notices of violation, more than 3,000 notices of violation within the first week, and then have continued to go through the enforcement process on those. We're currently with a lot of them at final 10-day notices. And we do, to comment on what Lena was saying as well, we do use our technology platform to assist us with that. So we know for sure that someone is indeed advertising when we do that enforcement at that point. So I take all that together, that we had, I think, a good process from the outset, and we've really tried to keep people informed about that process. We had a strong staff team that also is making sure and keeping the community updated and the mayor and council updated. And we're always trying to improve in that process as well. And so I think we've really come a long way over that time period to really build trust and credibility. Sure, do I occasionally have residents that are complaining about a short-term rental coming in their neighborhood? Yes. Do we go and spend time with them to help them understand what we can and can't do? Absolutely. Do I have short-term rental owners that complain that we're being mean to them by making them go through a licensing process, or that licensing process is overly difficult? Yes. Do we regularly work to make changes based on the feedback? Absolutely.
Great. Thank you, all three of you, so much. So there's a lot of questions in the chat. Let me try and summarize, I think, a couple of big themes, and then just open it to the three of you to answer as this applies most. So one question people were asking was about data, what data you had before you made your decisions. And I think probably particularly for you, Patrick and Lena, you know, given that you were really making restrictions and deciding, you know, how many per owner and where they are. And, you know, Lena, in your case, I guess, you know, what zones they would be in, you know, how much data you had before you got started. So Patrick, if you want to start there.
Yes, thank you. So a couple things there. When the city decided to limit vacation rentals to one person, our rules say that one person can only have financial or beneficial interest in one vacation rental at a time. Not quite sure how much data they were reviewing when that decision was made. However, our city does maintain a registry log of all vacation rental owners. And when that ordinance was passed, owners that did have more than one vacation rental at that time of adoption were grandfathered in to continue. So we do have, even today, a handful of owners that might have 1, 2, 3 vacation rentals from in the past. In fact, we have maybe a couple that have 5. And so they did not force them to remove those vacation rental properties, but they were grandfathered in. When it came to density, the data that we used was really from what we just maintained ever since 2017. So using our geographical neighborhood boundaries that we have, I was able to take all our vacation rental information and really use GIS software and really just look at. It was actually really started just from a fun project that I used to like to do, just to keep myself interested in how much or what's happening in each neighborhood, but really it started conversation as far as how many are in the vacation rental neighborhoods. So the data that we used when we looked at the density was really just taking our parcel data and utilizing data that we had from our county. We worked hand in hand with our GIS and IT department to make sure that the parcel data that we were using was in fact accurate and correct. One of the challenges we did is we also had a vacation rental group that met in the summer, where one of the topics that we wanted to discuss was density. And so information that I shared with our work group was the information that I had on hand at that time, which was how many vacation rentals and then how many were in each neighborhood. Wasn't really too sure if the GIS data that I was using was up to date. In fact, that was one of the questions that were posed by our city council at the time, is if the total residential properties that we were kind of calculated it to was, did it include condos or not, and such like that. So we me and the GIS and IT team met together and decided this is what we need to find. And so they did really work with county data, fire data, and really got an accurate count, and we were able to break down all that residential information down from how many single family homes are in each neighborhood, how many condos, how many apartments, how many mobile homes, and really embrace and encompass how much total residential units that we had in our neighborhood. And so using that data is what we presented to council as far as where we were at, as far as state of vacation rentals, how many were in each neighborhood. The working group that we had with respect to density, they proposed a 10% limit. And our agencies were at like a 25 to 30% limit, and really council kind of came to the middle ground and decided a 20% limit per neighborhood. But the density was really just those figures are really just maintained from our department as far as a registry log, and then utilizing our county data.
Yeah, and I think just to name, I think for our group, right, you already had your registry up and running. So you had an easy source for getting data by the time you went to that level of when you started getting to the density questions and the where would it be questions.
That's
right?
correct.
You already had that information. Lena, anything you want to say about data?
Yeah, for us, our zoning and us restricting our zoning started in the 80s already, where we already knew that we wanted to start and focus on the resort areas. Also, our community plans, a lot of them are saying that in the updates that our communities don't want to have short-term rentals. They're not going to allow new short-term rentals in the area. So our ordinance does specify, if the sustainable community plan says no new short-term rentals are allowed, you can't have it there. So in terms of data, we mainly have data on our non-conforming use certificate. So there used to be like 1,000 that was originally approved. It needs to be updated or renewed every other year. So it's dropped to 700. Those tend to be more in the resort areas, maybe a few handfuls scattered out into actual like single family residences. So our resort areas, they tend to be more multifamily dwellings or condo units.
Right. I wonder, so I think you started, Patrick, to touch on grandfathering. And so maybe I can ask about that. I think a couple of people are asking about, it does sound like both of you created grandfathering for, as you put these changes in place. And people are asking, when do those grandfathered things end? Do they end if you sell them or if you pass them down? Sort of what is the sort of rules around your grandfathering?
Yeah, I can start off with that. So with respect to if an owner has more than one vacation rental, they were grandfathered in, and once they sell that property, they're not able to like recover that one. So if they had 5 and they sold a couple, and they only had 3, well, they're at 3 until they can get down to 1. So really it's kind of a phase out period by the depending on how long they hold on to those properties. There was kind of a grandfathering or a phase out period, and with respect to multifamily dwellings. So in our ordinance, multifamily dwellings that are more than a duplex, so triplexes and quadplexes as such, that prior to 2017 had a vacation rental certificate were phased out in respect because they don't want multifamily dwellings or apartments to be used as vacation rentals to really reserve the housing stock within the city. So with that point in 2017, when that ordinance was adopted, they had till 2019 to either sell the property, start doing a long-term rental with respect to our ordinance or convert them into what we call a residential hotel, which had requirements from our building planning to approve as such like that. And then from that aspect, they would be considered a hotel and no longer a multifamily dwelling. So there was also a phase out period just with respect to that. But the grandfathering really comes to they'll be able to stay maintaining what they have until they dispose of the property.
Great, thank you. I think that we also heard there was a question about part-time residents. Do any of your ordinances treat part-time residents differently than full-time residents? And do they have any different say in in sort of what happens in the regulations?
From my perspective, they don't have any there's nothing difference between short-term residents or the long-term residents.
Yeah, we just classify them as the short-term rental owner mainly.
Yeah.
No difference.
Okay. And then Brent, just to give you a question here as well, I think there was a question for you on if you could do more regulating, do you have if the state allowed it, do you have a sense of what your community would want to do? What your top priorities would be?
Well, I'll answer that two ways. I mean, first of all, I think our mayor and council would have preferred we went back to 2015, where they were prohibited by ordinance. I think they would definitely say that they felt the longer term stays combined with the hotel stays was a better alternative. And so they were really frustrated that the state preempted cities. And I think would have rather come up with an approach on their own that might have allowed a much more limited process, like a conditional use permit, where you could turn one property in by going through a process, rather than allowing kind of by right short-term rentals, which is the situation we have now. What happened? I will say that most of the concerns I hear from the community are about either occupancy issues and the negative impacts associated with occupancy issues like nuisance party, noise, littering, trash, parking, all those things that shift a residential neighborhood into more of a kind of a hotel type property, right? I hear people say, I don't want hotels next door to me. I didn't buy in this neighborhood to have a hotel next door to me. Then the other issues are commercial in nature. So properties that are rented for the sole purpose of hosting events. And what we typically say on that is we have plenty of restaurants and hotels and nightclubs in our community that if you want to host an event at, they'd be happy to host it there. Don't rent a house just for the sole purpose of having a bachelorette party or something like that. And our community is that way. One of our neighboring communities, Paradise Valley, is even more so that way because they have some very large lot properties, very large size properties, and then those are just really ideal for that. I think had we had the authority to do it differently, we would have really targeted toward those issues, but probably kept the community more the way it was originally. And it was a very tourist dominated community as it was, and we did have seasonal rentals. They had to be done at least 30 days at a time, so you didn't have multiple different groups of people coming in within a given week. I think, but that's Arizona is we're the Wild West, right? We were the 48th state, so we like to kind of shoot first and ask questions later. So they just opened up unregulated and then are coming back in and trying to do some regulations, which is much harder to do than regulating in the first place.
Yeah. So I want to just ask, I think there's a couple of questions about the impacts that you've seen in your communities. So one person asked about what have you seen in terms of impacts on tourism? I know, Patrick, you said a length of stay increase, but have any of you seen less tourism? And similarly, I think, Peter asks about affordable housing. Have you seen, has the cost of housing gone down? Has affordable housing increased? Have you seen any of those kinds of impacts from your policies? So Lena, I don't know if you want to jump in first.
Yeah, because our ordinance was just passed last year, it's really hard to see those impacts quickly happening. We are able to see that there's definitely an increase of violations that we are able to give to people to stop them from doing short-term rentals, and hopefully then they actually rent out their places and make more housing stock available to residents here.
Yeah, great. Patrick? Or Brent, you want to touch on
Yeah,
that?
I can.
Oh, go ahead, Brent.
Let me jump in there and show this data just so you can see it. So I referenced before that we have a quarterly report, and one of the recommendations was to make sure we were collecting all allowable revenue. And so this is going all the way back to September of 2019, all the way to December 2022. And this is just the revenue we're receiving in terms of transient occupancy tax and sales tax from short-term rentals. So you can see it's been up as a high of $1.8 million in March of 2022. You can also see the very seasonal nature of that. So you see that. Then the second chart is what this is doing is this is looking at short-term rentals as a percentage of total short-term stay revenues. So both the short-term rental industry and then the traditional industry. And what you can see here is particularly during the pandemic, this is March of 2000, short-term rental stays were as high as 35%. In January of 2021, when we were experiencing a wave here in Arizona, it was high as 45%. It has seemed to stabilize in recent years, or in the recent year, going anywhere from about a quarter of the total to about 33 to 34% in the summer, which is low season for us. So we're also, watching this closely on the other side. So what occupancy is doing, both from a short-term rental stay, and occupancy on short-term rentals are typically around the 30% range year-round in ours, whereas our hotels are typically more up in the 80% range. So this is an interesting impact, because the economics for a hotel and what they're able to maintain to keep opening is completely different than the economics of an individual short-term rental unit. So the margin is much tighter on a hotel property than a short-term rental, and a short-term rental can only have people there, less than a third of the year and still be very profitable. Whereas a hotel, they're going to need to be up well over 75% occupancy throughout the entire year to be able to make that successful. And we're also very concerned about with 50 hotel properties, and we still do have some hotel properties opening up now. We're very concerned about losing those, because then you have these huge properties that are then shuttered, and what can you use them for, at that point in time. So there's a lot of issues to think about with that as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Patrick?
Yeah, thanks. So going to affordable housing, that's a tough question with respect to has these regulations impacted it, whether for good or for concerning values. So with the ordinance that we have currently in place, it does aim to help reserve affordable housing by helping maintain housing stocks. So for example, as I mentioned, with apartments, we don't allow those to be vacation rentals. Multifamily dwellings, we don't allow to be vacation rentals, in hopes that will still conserve some housing stock within the city that would be affordable in nature, to have a healthy, robust industry. Now, how the property values are in Palm Springs, they've increased, and what was unique that we've seen is that our vacation rental population, like I said, has continued to grow even with the introduction of these very strict regulations. And I think probably in 2017 we were at 1,800 to 1,900, and we're well over 2,700 now. But what was a rock in everything was COVID. And that threw everything to what we thought we were understanding to the side, because there was behaviors happening that we just never saw, where we saw nuisances at an all-time low in 2019. All of a sudden in 2020, they're kind of hot for that summer of 2020 again, because people were cooped up in the state of California, and especially the city of Palm Springs. We did not allow any vacation rental activity, including hotel stays, between the months of May and I think it was March, April, and May. And in June, we allowed short-term rentals to start operating again, but we did not allow hotels to operate again, not until around the fall. And so with that, a lot of everybody came into the city of Palm Springs to rent short-term vacation rentals. However, what we've seen now is, since all the regulations as far as COVID is lax, we've seen our transient occupancy tax kind of similar to Brent's chart, kind of come back down from the high transient tax that we saw in the summers, back down to average levels. And so that was really unique. And with respect to that, COVID also impacted the housing market in general. So how vacation rentals are impacting that is a tough question, whether other outside forces are really impacting the housing concerns. It really comes down to maybe thinking about, is there additional development being occurred in the city that can help and support affordable housing, where a lot of our areas have been built out, and there is land in the city. It's just really bringing those projects forward to help address affordable housing. And so it was really interesting to see, if vacation rentals in Palm Springs is a direct impact to the concern of affordable housing or not.
Yeah, great. So I know there's a bunch of questions about, tell me about the tourism, non-tourism, and the sort of hotels versus STRs in your communities. I'm not opposed to them answering those, but I know those are probably things you guys could find online. And I just want to make sure that we maximize the wisdom of their input on STR ordinances and policies before I sort of turn to that. Jim, I have a sense that you're going to ask again about the business entity determinations, which I did sort of ask, but Patrick, maybe you can let us know, because that's something this group has talked about. And there's been a question of, will people just game the system? How do you confirm it? Jim, anything you want to add to the way I just framed that?
It was well put. Thank you. We know that you do not allow business entities to own and operate STRs. It has to be a natural person or a LLC or a trust referring to a natural person or a few people. But our group, as Stacy said, has been discussing this. It seems like possibly a very important policy lever. Our question is, though, as Stacy said, can someone game the system? Is it possible to really determine that a business entity is not pretending to be something else?
Yeah, so great question. And I can actually update too regarding our rules. So we do require it to be a natural person that owns vacation rentals. We do allow LLCs, and we do allow trusts and personal trusts. And so part of the application process is we do verify ownership by running title, deeds, and just confirming who's applying for a vacation rental is in fact the owner of the property. If they own the property within an LLC as such, we do require their articles of organization to really spell out who is part of that LLC. And some of the challenges we have seen with that prior to this latest ordinance in December is where they start layering LLCs, where an LLC owns one and it's owned by another LLC and so forth. And we do go down that rabbit hole investigating until we find the natural person. If there's a corporation that's involved in any layer of those LLCs, we would deny the application. However, just recently in our ordinance, to help kind of mitigate that, we do now only allow LLCs to be consistent of 4 natural persons. So no more, and we're not really, if there's 2 people and then another LLC, then that other LLC should have just 2 people. And with respect to the latest ordinance, our city council did allow LLPs to now participate as a vacation rental. However, those LLPs must consist of only 4 natural persons. They can't have any other entity in it. And so really, can people still get around it? Yes, because for example, and we've seen this is during application and we require them to apply annually, where they might have applied as a single natural person. 6 months later, they changed it to an LLC. And then the 6 months later, when they come to renew, we catch it. And there's been some situations where we've caught says, hey, this person that's in your LLC already has a vacation rental, or hey, this entity in your LLC cannot be a vacation, cannot own a vacation rental. And so we aim to catch it on a renewal basis. And I think, from a gaming perspective, what we've really seen this come into play is where a married couple will say they separated and divorced to have 2 vacation rentals, but stay, personally involved, even though they're not legally married anymore. So we've seen that challenge come up. One is, even if they're a married couple, they still cannot own one or have more than one vacation rental or financial beneficial interest in a vacation rental. So with our latest ordinance, we clarified that. So when it comes to renewal, one does have to be dissolved.
Thanks for that. Okay, well, what questions did I miss here? I'm open to the group. Raise your hand if there's something I missed or you want to ask more about. Kathy?
Thank you. I kind of did want to know, I don't, just if you know that off the top of your heads, basically if you think about your community, what percentage of the lodging is available through hotels and bed and breakfast and traditional lodging versus STRs? That's question one. And the other one is what percentage of your, if you know this, your short-term rentals are owned by permanent residents or part-time residents?
Yeah, and Kathy, I think we heard them say before that they don't necessarily track whether they're year-round or.
What I heard, I'm sorry, what I heard was that they don't discriminate against them.
Okay.
That's what I heard. I didn't hear that they didn't track.
Whether they track, yeah. So if you have off the top of your head, how short-term, and just to be clear, right, this is particularly relevant in Nantucket where hotel and B&Bs are quite limited. And so that does put Nantucket in a somewhat unique situation. So just for context, if you do have that off the top of your head, if not, we could try and find that information later.
Yeah, I can comment to some of them. So, we have about 140,000 residential units in our community. And so if you think about it, the traditional tourism industry used to be about 10,000, 9,000 units, so 10,000 units. So that's about what it is on the total residential volume. So 10,000 units out of 140,000. Of course, its numbers actually higher than that because one's units, one's rooms, but it gives you a sense of kind of what that is. If you just look at the tourism portion of that, we used to be about 100% of it was the traditional model of hotels, et cetera. And now it's about 60% STR, 40% traditional. And it's complicated by the fact that the hotel industry has also got into the short-term rental stay. And honestly, this is why it's actually a little easier to work with Expedia Vrbo as a tourism community than Airbnb, because Expedia is advertising both on behalf of the traditional tourism industry and the short-term rental tourism industry. And so they get it. They don't want to, cut off their nose to spite their face in it. And they want to make sure that our tourism communities continue to be viable for tourism. So, we've actually, I think, formed a stronger working relationship with them, as a result. So now thinking about the composition of short-term rental owners, I'll speak generally in Arizona. So in some of our communities, like Sedona in particular, that because of its size, so it's under 17,000 residents, they're being struck by a high number of corporate owners. So particularly international corporate owners that are coming in and buying up entire neighborhoods and turning them into short-term rentals, which is exacerbating the housing affordability availability issue. We have some of that in Scottsdale. In Paradise Valley, which is a city of 10,000 next to us, they have like completely the nuisance party issue, as I mentioned. Scottsdale has a component of each one of it. People ask me, you know, hey, I'm thinking about a short-term rental in Scottsdale. What should I do? And we will say, you should either do that for long-term rent or put it up for sale, because there are more people that want to live in Scottsdale that could afford to live in Scottsdale than we have spaces. So we have actually a housing availability issue. So I would say that the other thing I would say is this traditional thought that short-term rentals are really people that are just putting their home up for rent to make a little extra cash. That's probably less than 1% of the market based on the technology. Looking at all the advertisements that we have out there right now. And there's an increasing number of people that are just in the business of short-term rentals. So they aren't residents of Scottsdale, they're residents of somewhere else. And they're using this as an investment. They're absentee. And that's one of the reasons why we've included a requirement that you have to have an emergency contact that can respond to the property within 1 hour if the police ask for that, because we want those absentee owners to really think about how they're managing their properties and not just thinking of it as kind of an investment that you just set the clock on and you allow the money to roll in, right? So I think there's some issues there to think about. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Brent.
Yeah, if I could touch a little bit more on what the city of Palm Springs has. And so the last review that I show is that we have a little over 5,600 hotel rooms in the city of Palm Springs. And as far as units, we're at 2,700 vacation rental units right now. With the question of how many of the owners that own vacation rentals are secondary, I'm going to say pretty much most are secondary, not living in Palm Springs. And it kind of begs a question that when we ask is, because the whole overall intent of the vacation rental regulations in City of Palm Springs is that the city views vacation rentals as something that an owner can use as secondary or ancillary of your residential property. So if you own a home in Palm Springs already, and then you have a second home in Palm Springs that you're trying to vacation rent, the question is how is that secondary when you live in the current market that you're in? We don't go too much further than that, but from that aspect, and the majority of, I think, believe are owners that live elsewhere, regarding maybe in Los Angeles or even San Francisco. However, we do have a certain permit in the city of Palm Springs, which we call home sharing, which allows an owner that does live in the city to rent respective rooms only. They're treated a little different than vacation rentals, whereas vacation rentals, you're renting the entire house. Home sharing, you're just renting a respective room or two. We do also require a local contact to respond within 30 minutes with any kind of complaint that is attributed to a vacation rental property. So they are required to maintain that local contact or face citations to themselves. Those property owners will get. And so with the owners being secondary and our goals for the ordinance to be something that's ancillary to the property, one way the city combats this is requiring that owners or agencies submit something we call a contract summary to us in the city. And so we limit how many times a vacation rental can be used as a short-term vacation rental. Currently, it's 32 times a year, plus an additional 4 in the summer. And so at max of current vacation rental owners in the city right now can only rent their property 36 times a year. And so with that, that really puts a focus on a profitability, I guess you could say, from owners thinking that they might be able to come in and just rent it every day, every weekend for the full year, which is not true, because the city does aim that, okay, you can rent it for half the year, but hopefully you're using it for your own personal use for the rest of the year. And with that, we do receive summaries daily of every property that's being rented, and we analyze this and make sure and confirm that these owners are submitting this data to the city. I think that's pretty much what I got with that question. Hopefully I answered them. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And we are closing in on the time that we have asked our guests to give us here. So I don't know, David and Peter, if I can just ask each of you to ask your question, maybe we can, you know, follow up with our panelists to see if we can get answers, or if there's a very quick answer here.
Well, if I can go, just a question for all three of you. When you instituted any policy about short-term rentals, was it instituted by the town council and forced upon the residents, or was it voted upon by the residents?
Right, so how was it passed? I mean, I
Right.
think this is sort of a governmental question.
Correct.
And again, this is very different here in New England and Nantucket, but my sense was that all of yours were passed through city council votes. Am I correct? Yes, thank you.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay,
Thank you.
thanks. Dave, anything final or quick?
I just really want to ask real quick, and I'm not sure whether it was Lena or Patrick that had pre-existing non-conforming properties that if they sold, that they lost their ticket to play, right? No?
For Honolulu County, it is transferable to the next owner of the property. They would just have to renew the certificate in order for it to be active. So if it's not renewed, then it's gone.
Okay. And Patrick?
And so ours does not transfer to the new owner. The new owner would have to apply as a brand new vacation rental property. And so if they're in a neighborhood that we have considered capped out, they would not be able to apply for a permit.
So if they sold, they lost their grandfather status.
Yep.
And that must be that must be zoning law specific to you in California, because in Massachusetts, I believe you need to abandon the use for a certain period of time before you lose the grandfather. So I mean, I'm just trying to figure out the differences, but thank you very much. Thank you guys for your time.
Yeah.
Been very, very informative.
Great. So yes, I also want to thank you all. This was really helpful, and we really appreciate you taking an hour plus out of your days to, you know, give our group advice. No promises that we won't come back and ask you more questions, but we really do appreciate your time here and your experiences. Thanks so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Great.
Thank you.
All right. So, and thanks panel for great questions. I think, you know, some very clear takeaways here, commonalities among the folks we heard from. There are, just in terms of trying to get your head around what are all the places and all the options out here, right? This was just a few options that we could just hear more from. And of course, there are ways in which they are some ways in which they might be similar to Nantucket, and other ways in which, as we heard, they're quite different from Nantucket. Nevertheless, giving some good advice about, you know, how they went about it and what seemed to work for them and what they learned. So I want to turn now to the one short-term rental per owner limit discussion. Karen, something you want to touch on before we do that?
I was just wondering, it just seemed like it was so much great information. If we could maybe pivot instead and use the time to just talk about our takeaways versus what we had planned, but I don't know if that's possible or how other people feel about it.
I mean, it may be possible to do both. I don't know. I guess I'll open it if people want to. I know people did the work of putting together their thoughts about the policy levers. We did get it out to you all in advance, so it might be possible to move more quickly through that discussion, and then we can come back to the takeaways. What do people think? Anybody have a strong opinion? Want to take time to talk takeaways first? John? You're muted.
I agree with Karen. I think while it's fresh in our minds, it would be great to have that kind of conversation.
All right, why don't we start by just taking 10 minutes, see where we get, and then we can reassess. Does that sound okay? So takeaways, anyone want to share some takeaways?
Can I would like to just, I think both the amount of strict regulation in terms of where you could open an STR against where you couldn't was very open in this situation. I think when we were talking about Palm Springs, he was talking about 20%. And then in another conversation, he talked about a neighborhood that was 50%. So, I'm not so sure that they have full control over that. What it really came down to me with all three of them is they have a lot of regulations like we do, but they don't have a lot of ordinances regarding the ownership or the use of the facility. It's really more just regulations rather than ordinances.
Yeah. And and to be clear, Honolulu also, they've strictly restricted locations as to where the short-term rentals could be, right? They weren't allowed in residential areas. They were only allowed in resort areas and right near the resort areas.
That's true, but you're also talking about cities that have major resort areas. We're Nantucket is
Right.
totally
Just to say that are separate from residential areas, right? Which, right, you guys don't necessarily have. Kathy.
Just a couple quick things. What I noticed, I think that one of them said that the 1 STR per owner, which is one of the things we're going to talk about, didn't have any impact. It just was sold to another person who ran an STR. So it didn't really have an impact on affordable housing, I think is what the takeaway I heard. Anyway, that's one I heard. Also, I think the idea that it's an evolutionary process. In other words, it's not one and done. We don't just finish up in September or November, whatever, and we're all done. I think that the idea that it has to be, let's try this, let's ease into it and see what happens and then tweak it and go forward. I think that's a really good thought process. And then just on a personal comment on Hawaii and why Hawaii is so different. I stayed in an STR this July, which is now illegal because you have to have at least 90 days to stay there. That the island of Hawaii has a very interesting demographic issue or difference from the rest of the country, I think, in that they have the native Hawaiian population wants to live in their neighborhoods with only native Hawaiian people there, which you can't do anywhere else really, and it's not something that we do on Nantucket, but that's a factor in there. I think that's a very, very strong factor. And I just know that because I was there because my son was prosecuting a case and a hate crime there, and that's the kind of thing that was involved. So there's another dynamic going on there, and they also have 1 million timeshares, which Nantucket does. Not only hotels, but they have 1 million timeshares and condos, because that's really where you stay. So there are a lot of other options for people to stay in Hawaii, and it's also a 365-day season, which we don't have.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. And just to note, right, like all three of these communities are 365. I mean, I guess in the summer, you don't necessarily want to go to them as much as you do in the winter, but and to say they all have much more robust hotel, right? So these are ways in which they're different. They have much more robust tourist areas, resort areas, hotels, etc.
And probably Hawaii is the only other one that's probably nearly 100% tourism, as opposed to the others probably have they have I think Scottsdale was 20% tourism, and I don't know about Palm Spring.
Julia.
Thanks, Stacy. Well, one takeaway is I think we feel lucky that Massachusetts gave us the enabling legislation because Arizona is in a very different place, and you heard that from Mr. Stockwell. So, you know, what they are able to do, I think we have a lot of flexibility, which is great. I totally agree with Kathy's comment that this is an iterative process and that you see no matter where you look at. Obviously, the Hawaiian Islands have been doing this for a lot longer. I wasn't quite as familiar with Honolulu, but I think with some of the others, and like they've, you know, Lena was talking about having ordinances in the 1980s. We're clearly coming at it from a different place. And I think that's what makes this so hard because, you know, we're starting so many years after Airbnb's been on, you know, part of the deal, so many years after, you know, there even are, you know, sort of this purely commercial use that probably wasn't there a bunch of years ago. So anyways, I think it's challenging for us to, you know, come in at this point and try to put something in place. And I think, but these guys give us hope. I think one of the things that I heard was, you know, when you get into these regulations and to the heavy levels of regulations, it raises concerns. I think anyone who thinks about, you know, the homeowner who's doing this as a part-time thing, it raises concerns that, you know, you don't want to make it harder for people who are trying to short-term rent, you know, just to try to pay the bills a little bit and, you know, really use the home. And it's not a job for them versus, you know, it sort of creates barriers to entry if there are too many regulations or, you know, barriers to even short-term renting your home to some degree. And I think you sort of heard that from, you know, sort of pushback from, you know, well, just Palm Springs, I think was the one who said, Patrick said that, I think it's him that said that the fee is now $900 for the registration. I mean, that is a really high fee for a regular homeowner who maybe just like rents an apartment for, you know, a few weeks out of the year. And so I think, you know, having this big enforcement department, you know, we heard that as well, like that's a challenge for Nantucket. So I would think that the amount of regulations has to stay under control. I think that's what I heard. But what's there has to be effective.
Yeah, thanks. Karen?
I heard sort of three things. Ditto. I just heard that it was a process and that, you know, it was learning as you go. And also I really heard all of them echo that they were trying to balance the different sides. And I thought that was a really nice thing to hear from each of them. The biggest thing that I heard was that they have all of these mechanisms for studying and enforcing these things. And that's been one of my concerns is we're looking at all these different possibilities is, well, how is that monitored? Who enforces it? Is there funding for that? How do you develop like the collaboration that I think Palm Springs mentioned between all these different enforcement pieces? And so it seems like we need to be really careful about throwing out some lever and then not knowing what happens with it or what's going to happen next. So I know we talked about learning more, a little bit about that piece of it, but that struck me. So
Great. Thanks, Karen. Jim?
Thanks. All great comments. One takeaway was a little parenthetical thing that that Brent said about Sedona, Arizona, multinational corporations buying up whole neighborhoods. And to me, that goes back to the idea of business entities. We may not have a lot now, but this could be a preventative thing if we do not allow business entities. I think it could be a very important preventative measure for the future. Of course, as Julie and others noted, Arizona prevents the ordinances from being in place, local regulation. Honolulu, it seemed like it's mostly by a neighborhood thing. However, Palm Springs does have ordinances, and I wanted to go back just a little bit to what Peter said. From the reading of it I've done, they do have ordinances who can own an STR. Of course, it's got to be a natural person. It can only be rented 26 or 36 times a year. They're reducing from 36 down in their latest one. The 20% versus 50% thing is they're trying to be fair and balanced as they were when they grandfathered in more than one ownership. They have a 20% limit per neighborhood. I learned this from talking to one of their other enforcement people. If a neighborhood is over that percentage now, they allow it, but through attrition, they bring it down. So if you live in that neighborhood, you won't be able to start a new one. So they're trying to be fair and balanced. They're trying to get it down to 20%. And to what Kathy said, I think what Patrick was saying about what did the one per owner not do, what he said basically was it didn't stop one non-STR person from being surrounded by a bunch of STRs owned by one person each. But it does affect other things, including the total amount. So I think even that policy lever does have something to do with it. But I think fair and balanced is the main takeaway I get from it, including if once we talk about the one property per owner, we really, I feel, need to grandfather in existing multiple ownerships. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. John?
Yeah, I'm going to just carry on from what Jim was saying, because this afternoon I did read through the Palm Springs Ordinance 2075 that Simonesh gave us a link to that. It's a lengthy document, but it's a good one. It really is, as is the second attachment for Palm Springs. And I guess instead of repeating what Jim just said, I do think that Ordinance 2075, it's almost as we go through our process, of the policy development, it's almost like we should read what they did and decide whether it's relevant in Nantucket or not. But if it is, why would we not do that? Because they've done a really good job of documenting the what they did and why they did. And it's all in that 2075. So, and because I agree with Jim, what the points he made about Palm Springs.
Great, thanks, John.
Be worth doing.
And Thomas, we'll take your comment and then I think we'll try to move to the analysis of the policy mechanism.
Yep, quickly, I just thought that was a terrific discussion. It was really nice to hear from all those folks on what their respective cities are doing, even if they aren't directly transferable to Massachusetts, or the Commonwealth, or Nantucket. And I think one thing to note, I think Julia and Jim sort of touched upon it, was the enforcement piece. And Scottsdale is about, their population is about 240,000. Like he said, they have about 140,000 units. Honolulu's population, looked it up, is 350. Palm Springs is 50,000. Obviously much bigger communities, but as far as enforcement goes, they can create large departments within their cities for enforcement. And anything that we recommend to town meeting should be a conversation with the town, et cetera, on how to create these enforcement mechanisms, because they could get complicated and quite expensive. And I'm not saying we aren't, but I just think that's a piece we need to keep an eye on moving forward as we debate these policy levers.
Yeah, great point. Right. And that enforcement, those enforcement departments, as you heard, is tied to the fees that they charge for the registrations for short-term rentals. So your thoughts about how you balance those, and what your thoughts about what kind of level of fee or cost for those you think seems right for Nantucket. So okay, so let me share my screen. All right, so this was talking about limit of one STR per person as a policy, and I tried to synthesize what we got from you all as results. So what is the problem that this policy tool is seeking to solve? Right. And I think we had really these were the main ideas here. Wealthy investors buying up multiple residential properties for use as short-term rentals. So not necessarily corporations, but having people with money for investment purposes, using residential properties as a business, removing them from housing stock, and eroding a sense of neighborhood. So the goal was eliminate or limit multi-property rental businesses from homes, from short-term rentals. One person said the problem is unclear. Maybe you're trying to reduce the number of vacation rentals total. You're just trying to have less vacation rentals, which this person clearly disagrees, or it doesn't think there's evidence that having this many vacation rentals is necessarily a problem or is contributing to congestion or bad neighborhood behaviors. One person mentioned the concentration of wealth in one Nantucket family or off-island owner. So it would prevent Nantucket from just being concentrated wealth of individuals. And then this one, I think, reiterates the theme about the purely for-profit purposes, right? So I really summarize, I think the problem people seem to think this solves is trying to eliminate or limit the use of residential homes as purely for-profit entities, by not having it be a big business operated by one person, multiple homes. Kathy?
So
Yeah.
when I look at this here, I mean, it looks to me like nobody's really sure what the problem is. See, it sounds like a lot of this is what the impacts could be, but not necessarily what the problem is. So that's kind of what I saw here. And I also, one thing we might want to think about is if what you just stated is the case, which is we don't want commercial off-island entities, then that goes back to this is maybe redundant with the true person thing. Just so that just throwing that out. That's what I thought when you went through this. That's what popped in my head.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, I think if I were to try and guess what the problem, if I were to try and draw a problem from this, right? It is a problem if residences on Nantucket are being taken off the market for people who might be using them, and instead being used as a business, as a lucrative business because you have multiple of them, right? So it doesn't stop some business use if someone owns one, but it stops a sort of escalating business use for one person operating multiple homes. That's how I read it. David?
Thank you, Stacy. Yeah, I mean, I see this as a solution looking for a problem, right? It spans too many, could possibly span too many things. And I understand that people want to reduce the amount of STRs someone can have because they're trying to get away from the investment or the corporate owned multiple ones. But what I see when I think about this policy is my neighbor who has a cottage and a house he inherited from his grandmother. And he rents his cottage in the winter to winter people, in the summer to short-term rentals, and he rents his grandmother's house for short-term rentals. These are local people that will be hurt by a regulation like this. So I think that we need to be more sensible and thoughtful than just say, oh, you can only have one, sorry, bye.
Yeah, hear you. Jim?
Totally agree with David, but that's why I think we could only even consider this policy lever if we grandfather in people who have more than one property, because they base their, their family economy or whatever, however you want to put it, on that. It would not be fair to take that away. So I think I would only even want to consider this if grandfathering is a part of it. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. David? Something you want to add, David?
You're on mute, David.
Jim's brought up grandfathering a couple times, and I'm just concerned the way that word's slung around is that people don't understand. If we grandfather and nobody abandons that use, it is in that use forever. So I think that the thought of maybe regulating it through bylaws with a sunset clause would be a better way of dealing with it.
Yeah, and let's just hold the mechanistic question here, right? Because there may be ways to do it by not through zoning, right, but through registration where you're, I don't quite know, and I think those are questions for Judy Barrett, of like, how can you what can you grandfather and not grandfather while allowing changes later, right?
Agree. I just wanted to put that out there to have people maybe think about it in a different way as well. Thanks.
Yeah. And John?
Yeah, just to go back to David's example, about his neighbor. I mean, when we really get down to, formulating what our article is going to be, it doesn't necessarily have to be one, does it? It could be two. Because on the island, we know that the situation that David was describing is a common one on the island. I think it's a common one just based on the people that I know. So, there's a difference though between someone who does that, has one and rents one. That's different to someone who's got 8 or 10, and people will give you examples on the island already of people that have got 30. I mean, I just think that if the common sense answer is to really try to limit this in a fairly strict way, well, then let's not get married to one. Let's think about 2.
Yeah, great, thanks. And someone did mention that in this when we get to that. So this was the data people mentioned would be helpful, right? Like we've got the right questions already in our scope of work for the town data analysts. How many entities own multiple properties? How many do they each own? And total number and percentage of STR operators who own, rent out more than one STR. For the purposes John just mentioned, maybe you also want to know how many they own is going to tell you, is it that people have 2 or is it that people have 30, right? And like that information will tell you. Some people wanted to know about geographical areas or differences there or changes in time. Someone mentioned, evidence of connection between short-term vacation rentals and congestion. Noting here, I think what Jim, you keep saying, the question here is not how many we have now in this situation, but how do we prevent this from potentially becoming a problem later by addressing it now, right? Okay, potential intended consequences. Potentially preserve residential housing, limit future multiple purchases, maybe slow down the growth of STRs, maybe encourage more longer term rental or year-round living, eliminate businesses owning multiple properties, and then, potentially reduce the number of vacation renters. Maybe people will be more tied to their properties. Those who are renting will be more responsive and careful. It will try to get more family-owned focus. then people said also, well, potential intended consequence is going to be denying owners with multiple properties additional income. So whether that's a good thing or a bad is a matter of perspective. In terms of unintended consequences, a number of people mentioned, yes, it would negatively impact those who have multiple properties and are doing this now if it's not grandfathered in some way. It'll limit some property rights. It might lead to lawsuits. It might lead to people trying to disguise their ownership. It could reduce STR tax revenue or tourism and local economic impacts if it leads to less short-term rentals overall. Someone thought it could drive up rental rates if it reduces overall number of short-term rentals. And it could reduce the value of the community impact fee if the group wanted to go with in fact, it would eliminate the value of the impact fee if the group wanted to go that route. So this is where a couple people said you would want to avoid confusion about definitions, property versus units. You would want to grandfather, and you would want to maybe consider 2 instead of 1. In terms of how people thought these met policy goals, very few people thought that it was highest major effect. So people thought at most it had a sort of minor effect. Some of these minor effects, quite a lot of neutral effects. Some moderate effects, some minor effects, or no effect, or potentially negative effect on these different policy goals. And I'm not going to sort of walk through these. You got them in advance, but I think from here to just sort of open, I think a lot of people said basically they think not necessarily likely to have a tremendous impact, but if you combine it maybe with some other things, it could be helpful. So from there, let me stop and open for discussion. John.
Yeah, just a short one. As I read through the intended consequences, sort of take it to a higher level than the individual bullet points. And I found myself thinking, this is what the traditional Nantucket renting model used to look like, or these kind of attributes were attributes of the way it used to be. And so I felt myself warming up to it, because will this on its own get us back to sort of the good old days? No. Does it feel like a step towards those days? Yes, it does. For me, anyway. Thank you.
Yeah. Great point, John. Any other reflections on this this particular mechanism? Right, and as you heard, this was also this is one of the mechanisms being used in Palm Springs. Yeah, Peter.
Yeah, one thing we just don't mention, and I don't know the number, and I don't know how you can find it other than going through every foundation on the island, but there's a lot of money contributed by these guys that own a lot of houses. One of them contributed $1 million to the hospital. It goes on. And I don't know, if we grandfather, it's fine. But if we don't grandfather, we're at risk of losing a lot of contributions to the organizations on the island.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Okay. So let's turn now to data and the process for data. The town, so the news is the town has selected a data analyst. I know we talked about you all having a meeting and a voice in the selection committee. Turns out there was one applicant. So was a pretty simple selection process, and the town did not want to lose any further time. And so they selected their one applicant. That applicant is a firm called Process First. And it's led by a man named Matt Hoffenreffer. He is a part-time resident of Nantucket. So some of you may know him. And thank you, Semanish, dropping in the chat the link to their website. And Matt and his team are very excited to jump in and get started. He did not want to come to today's meeting since he is just getting started. He wants to get a little bit of a lay of the land before he met you all in a formal manner. But as I think you all saw from Semanish's email, we've set up a subgroup meeting for Friday afternoon for any of you who are available to meet with Matt and his team and talk through his approach and any questions you might have for him. What you will see if you look at their website is, short-term rentals and housing is not that's not their focus. Their focus is data and data analysis for solving problems. And they decided to jump into this. In part, they thought not being experts in short-term rentals and not having background and necessarily baggage on one side or the other on this was an asset. And they are jumping right into getting to talking with Granicus, talking with NARAB's experts, and trying to, move as quickly as they can to really understand what it is you all want. So, yeah, opening it up. Kathy.
So just quickly, so subject matter expertise, which is the knowledge of short-term rentals and the data that we need and what it means, and then getting down below that's really, really important. So it sounds like there's going to need to be an awful lot, a steep learning curve there. So I don't necessarily think it's an advantage to not have any background in there. Yes, you won't have any bias, but it's gonna take them a long time, I think. And there'll need to be a lot of involvement from this group. Second question is, can we get a copy of their proposal before Friday?
That is a question is Megan on the call? Megan, do you know the answer to that question?
I have not been involved actively in this process, but I'd be happy to reach out to Brooke and others that have to see if I can obtain a copy of that for you all.
Right. I don't know those rules on procurement.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we have the statement of work, but we don't know what they proposed back or, so that would be very helpful before Friday.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions or comments about our new data analysts? Tom.
I guess in full disclosure, although I don't think there's a conflict here, Process First has a contract with the nonprofit that I work for to manage our data. So I work with them at least once a week on one thing or another. So just to throw that out there.
Thanks, Thomas. And is that on housing stuff, or is that on
food insecurity stuff?
Food insecurity. Yeah, great. John.
Well, yeah, I guess I'm just saying this for the record, Stacy, but the fact there was only one applicant doesn't, in my mind, mean that we should have, like, you don't hire one from one unless it's the right person. And, I just hope we don't find ourselves a few weeks from now wondering why we did this, someone that has no subject matter expertise and so forth. yeah, I mean, you
Yeah.
don't hire one person just because that they happen to be the only one, but that's just for the record.
Yeah, and I just want to name, right, we had two very important but also conflicting sets of interests in getting this data analyst on board. One was really trying to maximize the input and involvement of this working group, since this person is really going to be working for you. And second is a very tight time crunch. And so, you know, I think the town was trying to balance those things, and erred on the side of trying to get someone on board so that we could get moving. And I think that's what we're going to turn to talk about next, is the schedule. But let me take your comment, Dave.
Yeah, so I this guy did not come out of the blue. I think that his name was in there with NARAB when they were trying to choose someone. So I think that NARAB did not choose them, but I think in the end, he's going to deliver what we need. And that is, when NARAB and their person give us the information, he is going to be an unbiased set of eyes that can look at that data and give us an unbiased opinion. So I do not feel bad about this process at all. I think that we're heading down the right road. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Okay, so this takes us to the work plan schedule. We, I think, sent you out the newest version. I did have an initial conversation with Matt yesterday, and he was not sure about whether he was going to be able to get the information that he needs from NARAB in time to present to us in the schedule that we have here. I did check in with NARAB, with Penny, and her update to me was they are heavily into data collection, and she is not yet in a position to commit to a deadline. So I do think, but that she is in communication with Matthew. So I think that you know, there is still some question about when we are going to get the date, when Matthew is going to get the data from NARAB and be able to analyze it and get it shared with this committee. And I think this is, we have some important decisions to make about timing for our in-person meeting, because I know that you know, those of you who are coming in from out of town probably want to be able to purchase your tickets sooner rather than later, as the price of tickets, you know, only goes in one direction. So let me share my screen here on the schedule. Let me zoom in here. So this is the most recent version of our schedule. We had hoped that by next meeting, 2 weeks from now, Matthew would be able to present some initial data. I think Matthew will certainly be able to present on what he's doing so far and what he knows and where he is. Whether he will have gotten anything from NARAB by that time, we just don't know. I think for the following meeting on the 11th, it's also unclear that we're really going to have, whether we're really going to have that information ready to go. And then we were going to have a whole meeting to sort of really discuss our takeaways and elements of the proposal before coming together. My sense is, if this were the date that we got all the final data presented, then we could weave in the takeaways and discussion of elements of proposals into our in-person meeting. But if we don't have it by the 25th, it makes me wonder, are we ready to come together on May 4th for our all-day meeting, or do we want a plan B, or how do we want to handle this? Kathy? You're muted, Kathy. You're still muted, Kathy.
What about the data from the platforms and integrating that with the data from NARAB and picking out the duplicates? Where's the step for that?
Yeah, so that is part of the Process First team's work, and they do have money to purchase the data from the platforms. They do have to talk with NARAB and their team about the deduplication process to make sure that he's being given the information from NARAB's team that's going to allow them to deduplicate. Right, if they're already getting it anonymized, then it's going to be much harder to deduplicate. So that's something that he's in conversations right now with NARAB's team to try to figure out.
Okay. All right, so that's just not on there. So I was just wondering when that was.
Yeah, well, this is the meetings. This isn't the work that he's doing. This isn't his work plan, right? This is our work plan. So I do think we can probably ask him on Friday to share a little bit more of his work plan if it isn't in the proposal that he sent, and how he's going to fit that step in.
Okay. Well, we can't push it anymore, right? It is what it is. We have to just shoot for it, I think. Push for it.
Sorry, Karen.
Sorry. So I guess I'm just wondering, I think I'm hearing you saying you're not sure whether we should do the meeting on the 4th. I'm also wondering, should we, I really do need to know, as soon as possible, in part because May is kind of crazy for me, but I guess I'm also just wondering if it makes sense to plan a longer meeting to have more time. What if we're, if the data is going to be, if we're going to be getting information later, to kind of think about how to optimize the time. I don't know. Sorry, I'm getting tired, I guess.
Yeah. So, I mean, so far, I think what I'm hearing is like, maybe we're going to stick with the 4th. Imagine that's our in-person time. And then just start to think about, if we don't have our data by then, or we don't have complete data by then, we may need to carve out longer meetings later, if necessary. But we should still take advantage of this time to do as much work as we can to develop proposals to advance. Kathy, is that a new hand? No. You're muted still.
I'm sorry. It kind of is just throwing it out there. So when we started all this last October, and we were going to be done by town meeting, so I have a cruise to the Amazon that is non-refundable, so with no access. So I'll be on the island the last 2 weeks of April and beginning of May, and then I am gone. So, if I want to be involved in the data and all that as much as I can, but I've already planned and got my tickets to be there on the 4th. So that's my bias.
Got it.
It's my birthday for Daffy. I think I've told you this. So the town is having a big party for me, and I expect everyone to come to it.
There we go. Cake for Kathy's birthday. I'm adding it.
Thursday. It's the big one.
I'm adding it to the work plan. Yeah, the big one, the big 30, the big 30, Kathy.
Yeah, oh yeah, the big, more than twice that, yes.
I mean, and I think this, this public input session that we've sort of built into the schedule, right, really does depend on having proposals to, at least in draft, to bring forward to people, right? All of this said, I think, I don't know, I think I'll put out there just, one of the takeaways we heard from today about the iterative process, it may be that the data we have is the data we have that we can work with for this particular round for town meeting in the fall, and the group might need just a commitment that we're gonna do the best we can with what we have in the time we have available, since we really do have to have, if we want to have bylaws for that town meeting that has now been set for us, we really do have to be done by the end of June with the language ready to go. John?
Yeah, I kind of agree with what you just said, Stacy, mainly because if you listen to Patrick from Palm Springs, and they did a very good detailed job, their data seems to me, from what he said, was GIS maps and the tax inspector. So, I'm thinking, I was listening to him and thinking, boy, we are light years ahead of what they actually had. So if we get half of it, I guess we get half of it. So I would agree with you.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to sort of get a formal approval of the group, if you don't mind, that May 4th is going to be our in-person meeting. So can I just ask, is there anyone who wants to put out that we shouldn't have it then? Julia?
I guess I'm just wondering, I'm not quite sure I'm understanding. So if there is no data and the data, let's say, is Matt says he's going to be ready, I don't know, June 1st or June 13th, are you at some point going to make a call to move the 4th to, let's say, 3 weeks later or a month later?
No, what I'm suggesting now is that I'm asking the group if you'd like to commit that we're not going to move the May 4th meeting. This is going to be our in-person meeting, and we're going to work with whatever data we have.
If that's the pleasure of the group.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that? Kathy?
Just, maybe I'm dreaming and maybe I'm crazy, but I think there is a fair amount of consensus already within the group on some things we can definitely move forward. And maybe they're not everything, but there's something. And I think that these things are we're also supported in the public input that we heard. So I think that we can definitely come up with something that we can put forward in this time frame, and we'll just bracket it around those things we maybe are not sure of. Maybe we don't do those right now. Maybe we say those are for the future. And it is an evolutionary process. See how this works, and if it's not good, we need to do more. So that's my thought.
Thanks, Kathy. Peter?
I agree with what Kathy just said, and I also will be out of the country a good part of May. So if we move, it starts to get, I think, dangerous for everybody who's made schedules.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Thomas?
May 4th is also a good date because town meeting is 2 days later, and I'm not sure if somebody from the work group, Stacy, yourself, or Samantha has reached out to the town moderator to see if we were going to make a statement or whether we had agreed to that or whatever. but that could be a good time to do that 2 days after that meeting.
Great, thanks for naming that, and actually for reminding me that that was something we had talked about. I think there had been some outreach to the town moderator and we did not get an answer, and then the ball got dropped. So does anyone know anything further about that conversation? Has anyone checked in with the moderator on that?
I don't know about that specifically, but I do know that the planning board is planning, I don't know, David, you can tell me better. They're planning on speaking because they also are not commenting on some of the articles because they want to wait till we're done. So I know that they're planning on, at least I was told just yesterday, they're planning on making a little bit of a presentation there. We should be doing the same, I believe.
Okay.
That's what Andrew told me that yesterday, Dave.
Oh, okay, that, I know that we commented on the articles, the warrant articles, and they'll be included in the warrant. But other than that, and Megan can tell me if I'm wrong, I don't know about a presentation.
This is what I was told yesterday by Andrew.
Okay, so
Okay.
what happens when you're out of town? You're the last one.
So Megan, if you don't mind me asking you to sort of help us make sure that we can get that connection with the moderator to find out what might be possible for this group. And yeah, if the group is able to make a presentation, we can make sure that that's part of our agenda for the May 4th meeting, that we end with a presentation that you all feel ready to give by way of update to the community as a whole about the work that we have been doing.
Stacey, I think it should be more just, what we're working on all this stuff, but I don't think there should be any conclusions or anything specific about that. I mean, it's really just kind of a 5-minute, this is where, even that might be too long, of status of where we're at.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone else have thoughts on that? Kathy?
I think that's a great idea. And working with the moderator is really important. It'll need to be a voter because people who aren't registered to vote are not allowed to speak at town meetings. So the group would have to pick somebody who's a registered voter on the island.
Great. Okay. So given that we now have a little bit of time, I would love for us to, well, I can open this up for open space, but one thought I have is to talk a little bit more about other policy levers that you all want us to dig into, next, because I do think at our next meeting, yes, we'll get to meet Matthew. We'll get to spend, I would imagine a good hour or so with him. And where he is so far, I don't know how much time, actually, I just made that up, but I don't imagine it's 3 hours. So I assume that we'll have time to dig into a couple more of these policy levers and their analysis. So let me first check in. Are people feeling like the way we've been digging into the policy levers is helpful? Do you want to propose a different way to do it or anything? I think one thing Semanish and I can do is try to make a little, John asked for this since he missed the last meeting and we didn't have it, John, which is a summary of sort of what the takeaways on the 3 now policy levers we've talked about so far. So we could certainly try to do that. But just want to sort of open how people are feeling about this approach to analyzing the policy levers one by one, and what policy levers you think we should dig into next. Kathy.
Sorry to raise my hand first again. I was just wanting to take a bite of dinner and I was going to do that after. So I think that we ought to, and I think I've mentioned this as well, we ought to take policy levers and I would, all of the short-term rental articles that are out there, because they very well, we need to understand what they have in them, and there may be components of them we might want to use. Secondly, I think we need to address definitely as zoning something what we've been talking about is regulatory stuff, but we do not have anything we've discussed that would make it explicitly short-term rentals legal in zoning. Right now, there are lawsuits because there's ambiguity there, and we haven't tackled that. And I think we need to, some point, we need to put something forth that says whether, something like that. We have to do zoning. We haven't done that.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank-
And can I speak to that for a second? Because I think the approach we've taken is not necessarily going to work for that, right? Because if the policy lever, if the zoning regulation, for example, is aside from beyond all of the regulations and ordinances that are prohibiting or limiting short-term rentals, make the rest of them legal, right? And I ask you all to analyze that, it's going to be like, well, it kind of depends on what all the other short-term rentals or regulations we're putting in place. I think there's a little bit of an assumption, though, that you probably, you probably want to, you're going to need to have some kind of zoning regulation that says that, right? Other than all the things we've explicitly said you can't do, we want to make sure that it's clearly legal to do the things we want to make legal, right? So unless I'm confused, I think that's maybe a little bit of a given. And is there more, Kathy, you think would need to be talked about that?
Well, a lot of it depends on exactly that. I mean, these are general bylaws we're talking about, but what specifically needs to go in the zoning, and that's what we need to figure out. And yes, maybe it's a given and we just haven't talked about it, but we have to do it at some point. That's all.
Right. Okay. Jim.
Yes, I think we definitely will need to have that zoning item, just as you said it, Stacy, because we want explicitly it to be out there that short-term rentals are legal and allowed except for the regulations we come up with. As far as what we've been doing with each policy lever, I think has been really good and really helpful. It's made me think about it more. It seems to me that possibly two more we could look at, and they're not necessarily ones I think I would be in favor of. I'm not sure of that. I might be once I think about it more. But I think we need to look at caps, possible caps, whether it be percentage like it is in Palm Springs where it's 20%, or whether it be total. It's an issue we need to talk about more, I think. I'm probably going to talk against it, but that doesn't matter. It's an issue that we need to talk about. And we also need to talk about, I think, do we want to divide how our regulations work by neighborhood in any way, which I guess would involve zoning possibly in some form, like Judy mentioned. Again, I'm not sure we should. I think as Peter mentioned earlier, I think it was Peter, we're a resort, the whole island, basically. In essence, I realize there's more land around houses in Tom Nevers than there is on Back Street where I live. But I would probably argue once we get to that we shouldn't do this by neighborhood. However, I think some people have some strong feelings on this and maybe more versed on this than I and others are. So I think those are two issues that I'd like to see come up.
Thanks, Jim. John.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, Stacy, so that whatever the next two are, once we've done those, is it time that we sort of sat down with town council with the output of all of this, for all the ones that we've done? And just because it's been a while since we sat down with town council, it's got to be like 3 months or so. And for me, I think it would be helpful to have town council take a look at this and let's get, some input from them as to, what have no chance of flying at all and so forth. So that would be my suggestion, that use some time to meet with town council again.
Great, thanks. And John, do you have a sense that you would want to do that sort of at the next meeting, or maybe it's better to have a sub meeting where we've sort of prepped them and it's during his business day? Or
yes, definitely the second, and I would hold off until we've done a couple more.
Okay. Great, thanks. Peter?
I think we definitely have to give it to him beforehand. It's a lot of this stuff is new to him or new to whoever's going to be giving us advice. And we are in the middle of, there are lawsuits going on right now. So I think everything is tenuous and everything that's said is important. So I think we do have to give town council, a list of what we want to talk about and let them look at it for a week, and then we can talk as a group.
Great. So why don't I aim for after our next meeting, preparing something to get to town council and to try and between those two meetings. So the weeks, the maybe first week of April-ish, try to imagine a work group meeting, a subgroup meeting with town council. Julia?
Is it too much to ask if Judy Barrett can be there, or I find she dumbs it down so well and it's helpful.
Yes, I think Judy would be. Judy has made herself at our disposal. She really is happy to participate. So I will include her as well.
Great.
Yeah, thanks for that. All right, so caps, percentage. I think given that there's a little more uncertainty about exactly what this mechanism should specify, I think I might, for both this one and the geographic one, frame the form questions a little bit differently, where I will give you guys more of a chance to sort of lay out what's the best version of this you would want to propose. Right. So for example, because otherwise I'm not like, if we just say, do you like caps or not, we're kind of all over the place. So just trying to think about how we would do it, maybe sort of name what are a couple of different approaches or your top approaches of how you would want to do caps. If you did, where would you, what kind of total number, what kind of total percent, would you want it to be through attrition going lower, starting where we are, or would you want to, those kinds of questions, so we can get a little bit more into what actually is the mechanisms we've talked about so far. We had a mechanism and we just evaluated it. And this one, I think, we got to do a little more work to hone in on what it is. Kathy?
Just one thing popped into my head from the discussion we had with the panelists was one of the ones I thought was like a combination of things, maybe that might be, but I hadn't heard before, was that limit on the number of rentals per year. That they said it was 36.
Oh, yeah.
So that goes maybe to cutting down on weekend rentals, but not really saying it's weekend rentals. It's another lever that I'd not heard before. Now, again, not before for or against it, but I just think it's another one.
Yeah. No, that's a good one to add. And I know we did talk about that one at some point at, I think, our in-person meeting. It came up as an option. So let's add that in there as well. Peter.
I hate to say this, but I don't think there's a person on this group, on our panel, who is educated enough to recommend zoning by neighborhood or restrictions by neighborhood for short-term rentals. I mean, it's really way deeper than we're capable of doing. I think we can talk to people who are educated in that and get some ideas, but I think it's just ridiculous for us to say, okay, we think that they should have zoning restricting it in town, but allowing it in Tom Nevers. I mean, it's just, we're just not educated enough for that, in my opinion.
David?
With all due respect to Mr. Schaefer, I agree that it is a complex issue, but I think that it is a way for us to deal with the different characters of each area on Nantucket. Town already has 25% STRs. Do we want more? And I'm just throwing this out as devil's advocate, right? old historic Sconset, 25%. Does it need more? Lug 2 areas that have 2-acre minimum lot size for the most part, big separation between houses. Do we need to regulate how many STRs are there? So, and these are just questions, and maybe a percentage in zoning districts isn't the answer. Maybe there's a different way of doing it, but I think we really need to look at it carefully.
Yeah. And it seems to me that this is an area that's actually the most informed by data, right? Like the ones we've looked at so far, people have even said, we know the numbers are potentially small, but it's more of a preventative, right? And the data might inform a bit, but this one for sure, having more data about what is the geographic density of the existing short-term rentals, where are they and where aren't they, and et cetera, it would probably really inform the conversation. That said, no reason not to dive in and, you know, explore at least people's initial thinking. Karen?
I would just say yes to that I think it's good to like think it through, even if we don't have the data to know exactly what we're trying to do quite yet, but to be thinking through some of the implications. But just to piggyback on what Kathy said, I was looking at the Palm Springs stuff today, and they actually, where Kathy was talking about the 36 weeks or 36 contracts that they could have, they actually break it down into having a junior certificate with 6 contracts, and then they have a different fee for what they call estate homes that are more like 5 or 6 bedrooms, and they had it leveled out, so sort of different price points for fees. That it just struck me as an interesting idea.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, all the conversations that we will need to have beyond the mechanisms of what are the fees going to be, you know, do you want to have things be different for different situations? That's a whole conversation that we're gonna need to get to. All right, so I think Saminish and I will put our heads together and think about how best to ask about these 3. And that way we'll have them teed up and ready to talk about for whatever next meetings we have time to start talking about them. So we'll try and get those out to you before too long. We will follow up with the town moderator about presentation. We will follow up with town council and Judy Barrett, give them a heads up about setting up a work group meeting with them to talk through where we are so far on these mechanisms and their sort of thoughts about how we would do them and the legality of them. And trying to set up a work group meeting, a subgroup meeting the first week of April for that. And I think we've now agreed that the 4th of May is going to be our in-person meeting. So those who have not bought their tickets, feel free to go and do that. And we will plan. I would like to look at flights to figure out when we can get in and out and set the exact starting and ending time once I do a little more research on that. Any other comments or thoughts or suggestions or things that we're missing right now? All right, let me open this up then first to our alternates. Any who would like to make a comment as we move into public comment time, and then we'll open to our attendees. Robin.
I don't want to throw a wrench into the selection of Matt as the data analyst, and I don't know if people saw in the Q&A, but and the question is whether there was really a conflict of interest check that Matt went to Matt in terms of, before he was awarded the contract. But we had some text that he sits on the board of the Land Council. And I don't know, it sounded like from Dave that he's a known quantity and that there was some good commentary about him, but on the land council, there are a number of other people who are known to have anti-STR views and bias. So I just think that's a consideration in terms of potential conflict of interest.
Yeah, I think, Dave, do you want to speak to that?
I do. And I think that the suspicion is warranted. I like to err on the side of he's a professional. His reputation depends on it, and we can have him in here and ask him straight up. So I'm not discounting your concern, but I think that we need to treat him as a professional, and we need to ask him straight up. How do you feel? Is this going to be an issue? Because if not, then how far are we going to push back this process?
I mean, I take comfort from your comment, but we had a series of texts that came up in the Q&A. So, but again, I do take comfort. And
listen, he's a professional that runs a business. Is it worth flushing it down the toilet? I sincerely doubt it if he's gotten this far where he has a house on Nantucket. So I think an honest discussion with him is warranted for sure. Thank you. Thanks, Robin. I think it's a good call. It's just, I think we need to talk to him about it, to be fair.
Yeah, and I can flag that this is a question that, people would love to hear from him on. John?
Well, first of all, thank you, everybody. I thought this was a very productive and excellent meeting tonight. I particularly appreciated the panelists. As an at-large alternate, I have to say I don't find myself in disagreement with any of our three at-large members, Karen, John, and Jim. I think I agree with everything they said tonight. I did want to point out the obvious, though, and that is Nantucket is not Palm Springs. Nantucket is not Scottsdale, and Nantucket is certainly not Honolulu. That doesn't mean that what these folks said can't be helpful, but it does mean that I think that we have to forge our own path and our own set of conclusions and recommendations to town meeting. And I don't want us to feel biased because of something that some other city has done or some other entity has done. I think it's pretty clear how different we are from these three particular communities. Nonetheless, I drew two takeaways, and I think they have been reiterated or have been stated, but I'm going to reiterate them. One is that none of these three communities engages in discrimination between year-round voting residents and the seasonal non-voting residents. The rules are the same for everybody. And I think that's fundamental in how we approach whatever our solutions will be. Secondly, I was really struck by how overwhelming a lot of these regulations seem to be in these communities that are so much bigger than Nantucket and have much better resources or more resources for enforcement. And I worry a little bit about, as we chart our own regulations of STRs, of vacation rentals, how we need to be very conscious that there's no point in putting in place some kind of regulation that is unenforceable and that we don't have the capability as a community to enforce. So I really think we need to keep that in mind. What is our capability as a community to enforce the regulations that we are going to impose on lots of property owners? With that, I also agree with those who said, I think we're reaching some common ground here. And I know I said at the very beginning, I was hopeful, I've always been hopeful that we can reach a resolution. And I'm beginning to sense that there is some commonality, certainly among the vast majority of people on this panel. So once again, thank you for letting me comment and be part of this.
Thanks, John. Okay, so with that, I would like to open it up to public comment from any of our attendees. You should be able to raise your hands. Curtis.
Am I on?
You are on. You have our full attention.
Okay. I continue to ask why we are not looking at Barnstable and Yarmouth, which have been doing this since 2006, have very competent people. They're our nearest neighbors. And why aren't we reaching out to them instead of reaching out to Honolulu and Palo Alto?
Yeah, thanks, Curtis. Manish, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I do. So we actually did reach out to Barnstable and some other communities in Massachusetts. And while we did get in touch with them, some of them stated that they weren't comfortable coming to this group to talk about short-term rental regulations, considering how contentious of an issue it's been in their community as well as the Nantucket community. So we did reach out. It was sort of just a issue of interest or availability. So
great. Any other comments or questions from our public? Ron.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I thought the panel discussions were terrific, much better than I thought they would end up being, given the massive differences between those three locations and Nantucket. But one of the takeaways that I had from that was that all of their efforts seemed to be 100% designed to control nuisances and traffic and problems created by STRs. And by their own admission, none of them had any effect on affordable housing. And since affordable housing was something that was talked about a lot and an issue at the beginning of all of this STR activity, I encourage the group to reach out to the Breckenridge folks, where an article appeared a couple of months ago about how they had tried punitive measures to control STRs and found that they did not work, but that they followed that up with enormous success using significant incentive measures. And I think the Breckenridge community is pretty darn close to what we face on Nantucket. So that's all.
Thanks, Ron. And actually, you've reminded me, because I know there was a little bit of discussion about incentives. This group is really focused on short-term rental regulations, not on how, the full range of strategies to promote affordable housing or support year-round housing. But I know people have been sending around some information about different kinds of incentive programs that communities have been exploring or putting into place. We know about the program Vail has. There's a program someone sent around that I think is based in Tahoe, where the town actually subsidizes homeowners to promote getting them to do long-term renting instead of short-term renting. So I think it's a good point to keep in mind that this is one piece of the puzzle for some of those broader issues and concerns around housing and available housing. And while this group's scope does not extend to all those other things, right? I think it's worth you all having them in your back pocket for other efforts that the community might want to be moving forward. Okay, was there another hand? No. Okay. Well, with that, I think if we do not have further comments from the group, I want to thank you all for a really productive meeting. And next meeting, we are going to move back to the 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. timeframe. So we will see you all in 2 weeks at 5 p.m. and those of you who can make it on Friday to meet with to Matthew and his team. Take care. Have a good evening.
Night.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.